Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be diving deep into the third law of behavior change. Make it easy. We'll be exploring how to make forming good habits feel effortless and those bad habits a lot harder to slip into.
We'll be diving deep into the idea of friction and how it plays a critical role in shaping our actions. Plus, we'll unpack a fascinating case study about a photography class that really highlights the power of quantity over quality.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's get started. So before we jump into the specifics of the third law, let's talk about this idea of friction. What is it, and why is it so important when it comes to building habits?
Yeah, so in the context of habits, friction refers to any obstacle or resistance that makes a behavior harder to do. And it can take many forms, physical, mental, even emotional.
Okay, so can you give me an example of what that might look like in real life?
Sure, let's say you're trying to start a morning workout routine. Physical friction might be things like having to drive to the gym or not having your workout clothes laid out and ready to go.
Yeah. Okay, I can see how those physical barriers would make it harder to get going.
Right. And then there's mental friction. This might be things like feeling overwhelmed by the thought of a long workout, maybe not knowing where to start. And then there's emotional friction, like feeling self-conscious about exercising or being afraid of failing.
So it's not just about the logistics. Our thoughts and feelings can create resistance too.
Exactly. And, the more friction there is, the less likely we are to follow through with a behavior, even if we know it's good for us.
That makes sense. So to build good habits, we need to find ways to minimize those friction points.
Yeah, and conversely, to break bad habits, we want to increase the friction, making those undesirable behaviors more difficult to engage in.
Okay, I'm starting to see the strategy here. So how does this all tie into the third law of behavior change? Make it easy.
Well, the third law emphasizes that the easier a behavior is to do, the more likely we are to actually do it. It's all about reducing friction to make good habits as effortless as possible.
So it's not about relying solely on willpower or motivation. It's about creating an environment that supports our desired behaviors.
Precisely. And this principle is actually rooted in something called the law of least effort, which states that we naturally gravitate towards options that require the least amount of work.
That sounds like human nature to me. We're always looking for the easiest path.
Exactly. And you can see this principle at play throughout history. There's a fascinating example involving the spread of agriculture across different continents.
Okay, I am intrigued. What does agriculture have to do with the law of least effort?
So the primary axis of Europe and Asia runs east to west, while the Americas are oriented north to south. This seemingly insignificant geographical difference actually had a major impact on the speed at which agriculture spread.
Wait, hold on. How does the direction a continent faces influence farming practices?
Well, because east-west orientations share similar climates, and latitudes, crops could be easily transported and cultivated across vast stretches of land. But in the Americas, the north-south orientation meant drastically different climates, and this made it harder for crops to adapt as they moved north or south.
So it was easier, less friction to spread crops across Eurasia, which gave those regions a head start in agricultural development.
Exactly. And as Jared Diamond argues in his book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, this in turn had a domino effect on everything from population growth to technological advancements.
Wow, that's pretty mind-blowing. It really highlights how even subtle differences in friction compounded over time can lead to monumental shifts. So how do we apply this principle to our own lives? If we want to make good habits easier, where do we even begin?
A great starting point is to understand the difference between motion and action. It's a concept that's often overlooked, but it's crucial for effective habit formation.
Motion and action. I feel like those words are often used interchangeably. What's the distinction here?
Think of motion as planning, strategizing, or gathering information. You're moving around, but you're not actually making progress towards your goal. Action, on the other hand, is actually doing the work, taking concrete steps that produce outcomes.
So it's like the difference between planning to write a book and actually sitting down and writing it, or researching different workout routines versus actually putting on your sneakers and getting moving.
Perfect examples. And this ties back to that photography class study you mentioned earlier. The students who focused on taking a large quantity of photos, even if they weren't perfect, actually ended up producing higher quality work than those who focused on taking one perfect photo.
I'm starting to see the connection. By taking action, even if it's imperfect action, those students were learning, experimenting, and refining their skills along the way. The other students got stuck in the planning phase and missed out on those valuable learning opportunities.
Exactly. It's a reminder that sometimes the best way to learn and improve is to simply get started, even if it feels messy at first. Don't get caught up in planning and researching to the point where you never actually take action.
So it's not about being perfect, it's about taking those first steps and building momentum.
And each time we repeat a behavior, we're strengthening the connections in our brain associated with that action. This is where the power of repetition comes into play.
It's like practicing an instrument or learning a new language. The more you do it, the better you get.
And what's fascinating is that these changes are actually visible in the brain. Studies on musicians and London taxi drivers who spend years navigating complex city streets have shown that their brains physically change based on their repeated actions.
So our brains are constantly adapting and rewiring themselves based on our repeated behaviors. That's pretty incredible.
It is, and there's this concept called the habit line that visually represents this process. Imagine a graph where one axis represents the number of times you repeat a behavior, and the other axis represents how automatic that behavior becomes.
Okay, I'm visualizing it. So at first, a new behavior requires a lot of conscious effort. It feels difficult and unfamiliar. But as you repeat it, it moves along that habit line, becoming more and more automatic, requiring less and less mental energy.
Exactly. And eventually you cross that habit line where the behavior becomes so ingrained and almost like your brain is on autopilot. You don't even have to think about it.
That's the goal, right?
Yeah.
To reach a point where those positive behaviors become second nature.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that the speed at which we cross that habit line is determined by the frequency of our actions, not necessarily the duration of time we've been doing something.
Okay, I'm curious to hear more about that. How can frequency be more important than time?
Well, imagine two scenarios. In the first, you walk for 10 minutes once a week for an entire year. In the second, you walk for 10 minutes every single day for a month. The total time spent walking is roughly the same, but the group that walks daily will likely cross that habit line much faster.
Because they're reinforcing that neural pathway more frequently. So it's not about how long we've been doing something, but how often we do it. Consistency is key.
Precisely. And that brings us back to the third law of behavior change. By making a behavior easier to perform, we're more likely to do it consistently, which accelerates the process of crossing that habit line and turning it into a truly automatic habit.
This is all starting to click for me now. But before we go any further, I'd love to hear more about practical strategies for making those good habits easier to adopt. What are some specific things we can do to reduce that friction and set ourselves up for success?
That's a great question, and it's what we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive. We'll unpack specific techniques for optimizing your environment, priming your surroundings, and leveraging the power of one-time actions to create lasting change.
I'm ready to hear it all. Stay tuned, listeners. We'll be right back after a quick menu. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Before we took a break, we were discussing the power of repetition and how it helps us move along the habit line, making those desired behaviors more and more automatic.
And now we're going to shift gears and delve into some practical strategies for actually putting the third law of behavior change into action.
I'm ready for the actionable tips. So how do we actually make those good habits easier?
Well, one of the most effective ways is to optimize our environment. By strategically designing our surroundings, we can make it easier to perform the behaviors we want to cultivate and harder to engage in the ones we want to avoid.
I'm all about making things easier. Give me some examples of how we can optimize our environment for better habits.
Let's say you're trying to eat healthier. You could keep a bowl of fresh fruit on the counter, making it the first thing you see when you walk into the kitchen. Or you could prep healthy snacks for the week ahead so you're not tempted to reach for those processed foods when you're short on time.
Those are simple but effective strategies. It's about making the healthy choice the most convenient option.
Exactly. Or think about your workout routine. If you're always rushing in the morning, lay out your workout clothes the night before so you're not scrambling to find them when you're half asleep. Or if you tend to get distracted at home, designate a specific area as your workout zone free from clutter and distractions.
It's about removing those little barriers that can easily derail our good intentions. I can definitely see how those small tweaks to our environment can make a big difference in our daily choices.
And you know, this idea of optimizing your environment isn't just for personal habits. Companies use these strategies all the time to increase productivity and efficiency.
Oh, that's interesting. Tell me about how companies are applying these principles.
A great example is that Japanese television manufacturer we discussed earlier. They completely redesigned their workspace to minimize wasted motion, making it easier for employees to assemble their products efficiently.
And remember, they ended up being 3 times more productive than their American counterparts who were still using the old layout. That's pretty impressive. But, sometimes even with a perfectly optimized environment, those bad habits can still creep in. What strategies do we have for combating those pesky temptations?
Well, one powerful technique is to use something called a commitment device. It's a choice you make in the present to control your actions in the future, essentially locking in your desired behavior.
Oh, I remember that story about Victor Hugo locking away his clothes so he wouldn't be tempted to leave the house and procrastinate on his writing. That's a classic example of a commitment device.
Exactly. And, commitment devices don't have to be that extreme. They can be simple and subtle adjustments to your environment or routine. For example, if you're trying to limit your social media use, you could delete those apps from your phone or use a website blocker during work hours. Or if you tend to overspend, you could leave your credit cards at home and only carry a set amount of cash.
It's like making it harder to access those temptations, adding an extra layer of friction to those undesirable behaviors. I like it.
And there's a really fascinating historical example of a commitment device that had a major impact on workplace behavior. In the mid-1800s, employee theft was a rampant problem. Then James Ritty invented something called the incorruptible cashier, which was essentially the first cash register.
Oh, I remember reading about that. It automatically locked away cash and printed receipts, making it nearly impossible for employees to skim money without getting caught.
Exactly. Ritty basically designed an environment where stealing was no longer the easy option. He increased the friction associated with that behavior, and it dramatically reduced theft in his store.
That's brilliant. It's like he used environmental design to enforce honesty. So we've talked about optimizing our environment and using commitment devices. What other strategies can we use to make those good habits stick?
Well, one approach that's gaining popularity is the concept of one-time actions. These are things you do once that automate good habits or eliminate bad ones for the long term.
One-time actions. I like the sound of that. It sounds like a way to create systems that work for us even when our motivation is running low.
Exactly. Think of it like setting up a domino effect. You make one strategic move, and it triggers a chain reaction of positive outcomes.
Give me some real-world examples. What are some one-time actions people are using to simplify their lives and improve their habits?
Sure. Let's say you want to drink more water. You could buy a high-quality water filter and a reusable water bottle, making it easier and more enjoyable to stay hydrated throughout the day. Or, if you're always forgetting to take your vitamins, you could set up an automatic subscription so they're delivered to your door each month.
Those are great examples. It's about removing those little decision points that can drain our mental energy and make it harder to stick to our goals.
And the beauty of one-time actions is that they often have a ripple effect leading to other positive changes. For example, if you decide to get a dog, that one-time action can lead to increased daily activity, more social interaction, and even reduced stress levels.
It's like that initial choice sets off a chain reaction of benefits. So it's not just about simplifying our lives, it's about creating a system that supports our overall well-being.
And in today's tech-driven world, we have more opportunities than ever to automate our good habits and make those positive behaviors practically unavoidable.
Technology can definitely be a powerful tool for habit formation, but I think some people are hesitant to embrace it fully. They might feel like it's taking away their control or making them too reliant on external systems.
I understand that perspective, but I think it's important to remember that technology is simply a tool. It's up to us to use it in a way that supports our goals and values.
That's a great point. It's about using technology intentionally, not letting it control us. What are some specific ways we can leverage technology to automate our good habits?
Well, there are countless apps and devices designed to make habit formation easier. You can set reminders to drink water, track your progress towards fitness goals, or even join online communities for accountability and support.
And there are also more subtle ways to use technology to our advantage. For example, you could set up automatic bill pay to avoid late fees, or you could use a grocery delivery service to reduce impulse purchases at the supermarket.
Those are excellent examples, and it's not just about convenience. By automating these tasks, we're freeing up our mental energy and willpower for other more important decisions.
It's about working smarter, not harder, in creating a system that supports our best selves.
Exactly. And one of the most powerful technology-based strategies for habit formation is something called the 2-minute rule. It's all about mastering the art of starting small.
Okay, I've heard of the 2-minute rule before, but I'm not entirely sure how it works. Can you explain the magic behind starting small?
Absolutely. But before we delve into the specifics of the 2-minute rule, we need to understand the concept of decisive moments. These are those seemingly insignificant choices we make throughout the day that actually set the course for how we spend our time and energy.
Give me an example of a decisive moment. What might that look like in real life?
Think about the moment you wake up in the morning. Do you hit the snooze button and scroll through social media? Or do you get out of bed, drink a glass of water, and head outside for a walk? That initial choice, that first action, can set the tone for the entire day.
So it's about being mindful of those seemingly small decisions, recognizing that they have the power to influence our actions for hours to come.
Precisely. And the 2-minute rule helps us win those decisive moments. The rule states that when you start a new habit, it should take less than 2 minutes to do.
So instead of trying to overhaul your entire routine overnight, you focus on those tiny, ridiculously easy to start actions.
Exactly. Instead of trying to run 3 miles, just focus on putting on your running shoes. Instead of cleaning the entire house, just focus on clearing off the kitchen counter.
It's about breaking down those larger goals into bite-sized chunks that feel manageable and achievable. I can see how that would reduce the intimidation factor and make it easier to get started.
And by focusing on the starting ritual, you're essentially tricking your brain into taking action. You're building momentum, and once you've overcome that initial inertia, it's much easier to keep going.
So the 2-minute rule isn't about limiting yourself to 2-minute tasks. It's about mastering the art of starting and creating a gateway habit that naturally leads to the more desired outcome.
That's right. And remember, you can't optimize a habit that doesn't exist. The first step is to simply establish the behavior, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem.
Make it easy, make it consistent, and watch the magic happen.
Exactly. But you know, there's another layer to this whole concept of starting small that we haven't touched on yet. The idea that even habits completed in just a few seconds can have a ripple effect shaping our actions for minutes or even hours afterward.
Okay, that sounds intriguing. Tell me more about this ripple effect.
We'll delve into that fascinating concept and how it can amplify the power of the 2-minute rule when we return for the final part of our deep dive.
Stay tuned, listeners. We'll be right back after a quick nap.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Before the break, we were teasing this idea that even tiny habits, those completed in just a few seconds, can have a ripple effect on our behavior.
Yeah, it's a fascinating concept. Think of it like this. Habits are the entry ramp to a highway. Once you're on that highway, it's much easier to keep going in the same direction.
So our habits set us on a course, influencing our subsequent actions. Exactly. Let's say you start your evening by mindlessly scrolling through social media. That seemingly harmless habit can easily lead to, an hour or two wasted as one video leads to the next, and you get sucked into that endless scroll.
Oh, I've been there. It's like a digital vortex. It's hard to escape.
Right, but what if you started your evening by, reading a book? You'd be more likely to continue down that path of, relaxation and mental stimulation.
So it's about being mindful of those initial choices, those decisive moments that can set the tone for the hours that follow. But how do we make sure we're choosing the right on-ramp, so to speak?
There's a helpful analogy that might make this a little clearer. Imagine walking into a restaurant for lunch. Your initial choice of where to sit determines the options available to you. If you sit at the bar, you're more likely to order a drink. If you sit at a table, you're more likely to focus on the food menu.
Interesting. So it's like our habits create a menu of choices, narrowing down our options based on that initial decision.
Precisely. And the more we repeat those habits, the more ingrained those pathways become, and the less likely we are to even consider alternative options. It's like our brain is saying, we've been down this road before, let's just stick with what we know.
That makes sense. So we want to change our behavior. We need to be intentional about those initial choices, those fork-in-the-road moments that can lead us toward, a productive day or an unproductive one.
And that's where the 2-minute rule comes in again. It's not just about simplifying a habit, it's about creating a ritual, a trigger that tells your brain it's time for this behavior.
So by focusing on those first 2 minutes, we're essentially setting off a chain reaction of positive choices that can ripple throughout our day.
Exactly. And here's a powerful truth. Nobody actually aspires to feel like they're tricking themselves into doing something they know is good for them but don't feel like doing. The 2-minute rule just helps make it easier.
Oh, that makes sense. It's about overcoming that initial resistance and finding ways to make those positive choices feel more natural and effortless.
And the more we practice those 2-minute habits, the more those actions become ingrained in our daily routines, shaping our behavior for the better.
It's like we're rewiring our brains one small habit at a time.
Precisely. And that's the beauty of the third law of behavior change. It's not about willpower or motivation. It's about understanding the science of how habits work and using that knowledge to our advantage.
Make it easy, make it consistent, and watch those positive changes unfold.
Exactly. And remember, even small changes compounded over time can lead to remarkable results.
This has been a fantastic deep dive. We've covered so much ground, from the power of repetition and the law of least effort to the magic of the 2-minute rule and the importance of automating good habits.
It's been a pleasure exploring these concepts with you.
And before we sign off, I'd like to leave our listeners with one final thought. As you go about your day, be mindful of those decisive moments, those seemingly insignificant choices that can shape the course of your actions.
Ask yourself, what's one small habit I can make easier today? One tiny step I can take to set myself on a path towards a more positive and fulfilling life?
Because even the smallest actions, when repeated consistently, can create a ripple effect that transforms your habits, your health, and ultimately your life. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of human behavior and the power of habits.